I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States.
And I'm Jason Shi, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and a former legislator from Taiwan. Welcome to Taiwan Frontlines podcast, created in partnership with Nownews through its English language platform, Taiwan Current News. Today's conversation is about power, risk, and decision-making in a world where technology, geopolitics, and security are colliding faster than our institutions were designed to handle.
Questions surrounding China, Taiwan, artificial intelligence, and national security are no longer abstract or academic. They shape real choices, often made under pressure with imperfect information and with long-term consequences. Our guest today has been at the center of these choices. Jake Sullivan served as the National Security Advisor to President Joe Biden from 2021 to 2025, coordinating foreign policy, defense strategy, and emerging technology issues. Prior to that, he was a senior policy advisor to President Obama, playing a central role formulating U.S. strategy toward China and helping to shape Washington's approach to alliances, economic statecraft, and technology competition. Welcome to the Taiwan Frontlines podcast, Jake, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me here. I really appreciate it.
Welcome, Jake. Let's dive right in. During your tenure, U.S. policy shifted from managing competition to something closer to managing structural rivalry. What changed in China's behavior and U.S. assessments of China's intention, and that led to this shift?
Well, I think we saw a number of factors over the course of the period leading up to President Biden coming into office. One was China was engaged in the largest peacetime buildup of military forces basically in human history. So it was modernizing its military, building its capabilities in quite dramatic ways, and therefore posing an increasing threat and challenge to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. Second, we saw increasingly the degree to which reliance on China for critical inputs in supply chains was putting the United States and our allies at risk, and that we needed to create more secure and resilient supply chains to push back against that. And then third, we saw China adopting a very assertive strategy with respect to technology domination, trying to get to the commanding heights of frontier technologies as the top leader's highest priority, both for economics and national security. And we recognized that we had to make sure that we were competing vigorously to ensure that the United States remained not just at the innovation edge, but could produce at speed and scale the technologies of the future alongside our allies and partners. So when you added all that up, it was true that when we came into office, we felt that China was determined to surpass the United States as the world's leading power. But we were also very cognizant of the fact that whatever happened in the competition, China wasn't going anywhere, the United States isn't going anywhere, and we were going to have to learn to live alongside one another as major powers. So the watchword for us was competition, not conflict. And we wanted to make sure that we could manage the competition in a way that kept it from veering into conflict.
Yeah, and looking at how competition has been shaped, do you find there are any areas that U.S. and China can co-work still, given how the trend has been taking a drastic turn and even more intensified in this way?
I do, absolutely. In fact, a big part of effective management of competition is not just about avoiding conflict. It's about creating space for working together where our interests align. Let me give you a couple examples. During my time as National Security Advisor, we made real progress on fentanyl. Precursors from China were driving fentanyl production in the Western Hemisphere, ultimately leading to the deaths of very large numbers of Americans. We worked together with the Chinese government to reduce the flow of those precursor chemicals, and there was just recently a study in Science, which is the preeminent American scientific journal, that showed directly how U.S.-China diplomacy led to a dramatic decline in deaths in the United States. That's good for the American people. Frankly, I think it's good for China not to be the source of this illicit drug trade. And it's the kind of thing we can do working together. And then I think the next big agenda item on a going forward basis has to be managing the risk of artificial intelligence. The U.S. and China are the two major movers in AI, the two leading players. And there's huge opportunity and upside with artificial intelligence. There's also real risk. And that risk is not to any one country, it's to all of us. And the U.S. and China have to find a way to work together to cooperate to manage that risk effectively. We took some initial steps in the Biden administration. I'd like to see when President Trump and President Xi actually meet that this be one of the top agenda items.
One of the most, I think, tense moments, Jake, in the U.S.-China relationship that involved Taiwan was our former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the lessons you drew from that, and then about how you manage that with Beijing. And of course, subsequent to that, there was the whole balloon incident.
Right.
And I understand that when you initiated the dialogue, the quiet dialogue that you had with China's top diplomat Wang Yi, that those discussions were particularly important regarding management of differences over Taiwan. And so can you talk a little bit about the importance, the role of that dialogue that had in diffusing these issues and ensuring that we didn't misunderstand each other on our differences over Taiwan?
Absolutely. And so I'll start with the Pelosi visit. There was a parade of us who went up to Capitol Hill, myself, Kurt Campbell, Bill Burns, Mark Milley, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, to talk to Speaker Pelosi about the Biden administration's concerns about her going. So even in advance, it's not that we just needed to learn lessons in the aftermath. Our assessment was that, yes, this would be some kind of symbolic statement of support for Taiwan, but it would elicit a reaction from China that could end up leaving Taiwan in a worse position, not a better position. And this was the case we made to her. But President Biden had spent decades in the United States Senate. He is a creature of the Congress. He is a deep believer in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Article 1 is the congressional article. Article 2 is the executive or the presidential article. And he made clear to us that he was not going to tell her what to do. He would advise her, give her our perspective, but ultimately it was her decision. And she looked at all of us and basically said, I'm sorry, I disagree with you. Frankly, I've disagreed with multiple administrations of both parties. I think you guys have not been strong enough on these issues, you guys being basically anyone who's worked in the White House in the last 25 years. And I'm going to do it. And she did it. And I think the single biggest lesson to me for effective management of the U.S.-Taiwan relations is substance over symbolism, that it is much more important for us to focus on things that are actually going to strengthen Taiwan's self-defense, its economic vitality, its democracy, its place in the international community, and not symbolic acts that, in fact, could end up leading to a series of events that put Taiwan in a tighter spot. And I think the net result of the Pelosi visit was increasing encroachment militarily, increasing pressure across multiple dimensions, and that net result has not left Taiwan more secure or better off. And so it's unfortunate that it played out that way. Now, at the risk of going on too long, I'll just tee up kind of how we got to the Wang Yi channel. After the Pelosi visit, President Biden and President Xi had the opportunity to meet in Bali, Indonesia at the G20. It was the first time they met in person, nearly 2 years into President Biden's tenure. And keep in mind, that's because it was only shortly before then that Xi Jinping started traveling because of COVID. So we had this unusual circumstance where the U.S. president and the Chinese leader weren't having opportunities in the first 18 months of the president's term to get together. And I think that had an impact on management of the relationship. So they get together in Bali, and we put a bit of a floor under the relationship after the Pelosi visit. Still tense, but I think an opportunity to move forward. Then a couple months later, a Chinese spy balloon appears in the skies over the United States of America, floats along for several days in full view of the American people, and finally President Biden makes the decision to shoot it down. And I think U.S.-China relations hit a low point after that. So we took the decision that I would go sit with Wang Yi for 2 days in a neutral country, in this case in Vienna, Austria, to talk through all of the aspects of the U.S.-China relationship, but particularly as charged by the leaders, by Biden and Xi, to talk about how we manage cross-strait relations, Taiwan, in the context of the U.S.-China relationship. And that's what we did. And end soliloquy for now, but happy to dig into, how that ended up playing out.
So during the Biden administration, there, I think, were increasing calls from at least some quarters that the United States should revisit the position of strategic ambiguity, which really isn't actually in any U.S. document, right. But people say is U.S. policy. And of course, it's just that the United States does not take a firm position on whether or not we would come to Taiwan's defense if it were attacked. But I always tell people that Indo-PACOM spends a great deal of its time planning for this possible contingency. Right. But President Biden's approach to this was different. And as you referred to earlier, in part because I think he spent so much time in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and was there when the Taiwan Relations Act was passed. So the Biden administration said, of course, during the entire 4 years that the United States would adhere to this position, or at least not change its policy. And yet the president said whenever he was asked that he would come to Taiwan's defense if it were attacked. Now we have a president who has said that one of the ways in which he has leverage over China is to not say what he would do in the event of a Chinese attack. But this administration also says its policy hasn't changed. So do you think that the approach to this strategic ambiguity component of our policy is still the right way to go? Have any of these arguments that people have made that have called for strategic clarity in some way, revising our policy, have those resonated with you? Or do you think we should go back to what we even had before the Biden administration, which was not having the president really say anything about whether or not we would come to Taiwan's defense?
So I can't remember who said it, that democracy is the worst form of government except for every other form of government. In a way, strategic ambiguity is the worst policy except for every other policy. I think that the risk-reward calculus of a significant shift in U.S. declaratory policy on Taiwan probably militates in favor of keeping things as they are. I say probably advisedly, though, because I do think simply relying on the fact that it has worked in the past does not necessarily mean it will work permanently in the future. And it does mean that it's a legitimate question to say, how exactly should the U.S. formulate its attitude towards the question of changes to the status quo, defending Taiwan independence, all of these questions. I think having experts on these issues debate the puts and takes, I think having people write and propose, hey, maybe we should do this a different way, that's very healthy. So far, I have to say, I think the weight of the fact that the policy as formulated has helped maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, and that all of the alternatives have various downsides. And also there's just a risk that if you change a policy, people will misunderstand why or what exactly the point was. And then you spend a lot of time scrambling to try to reassure different folks. And once you do that, then you're creating more of a jumble of what's real and what's not. So there's both kind of broad conceptual strategic concerns I have about a change in the policy. And then there's the much more practical reality that when you try to change policy, actually executing a change in a seamless way, in a way where it lands where you want it to land, much harder than you might think. And of course, I have that experience in a way because President Biden did on multiple occasions get asked, would America come to Taiwan's defense if it's attacked? And on multiple occasions, he said yes. And then he said, it wasn't just the administration, but he personally said, our policy has not changed. Now, Joe Biden is somebody who really does not like ambiguity, doublespeak, secret formulas, dodgy answers. So imagine briefing him and saying, Mr. President, when you get asked this question, you dodge and duck and say nothing at all, or you say something kind of non-responsive, like our policy is to ensure that never comes to pass. He will look at you like you have three heads and say, excuse me, if I get asked a hypothetical question, I'm just going to give an answer. And so for me, this was not about, on his part, some grand scheme. It was deeply embedded in his personality as a politician, a straight-talking guy. And he also felt strongly as a very responsible steward of U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific and towards cross-strait relations that we continue to assert with total consistency our policy hasn't changed. So I think it worked out okay in the Biden administration. I don't think, in fact, in some ways one could argue that this balance of him directly answering hypotheticals and us saying our policy hasn't changed was a perfectly sound way to proceed. But in general, I think sustaining the U.S. posture on this is probably right. But I'm going to finish with that tentative probably because, I'm still grappling with this.
Great.
Yeah, Jake, the recent proposed defense budget within Taiwan to the U.S. has caused quite a bit of heated debate in Taiwan's domestic politics. And the delay in passing the defense budget actually also caused senators in the Washington, such as Senator Wicker, Senator Sullivan, to issue statements urging Taiwan passing the urgent need of a defense spending and defense investment. And from Washington's perspective and from your experience, what would be a good way for Taiwan to think about this issue, considering balancing the different opinions within Taiwan, as well as sending seriousness of the signals to the world that Taiwan is prepared for its own self-defense?
Look, first I'm going to speak with some humility here because as Americans, we have plenty of problems passing our own budgets. We sit here today in the GMF studio as the government's about to shut down over DHS funding. So little hard to tell others, get your legislative house in order and pass things. So I'm perhaps not in a great position to provide particular advice on that. What I think I can say at a basic level of strategic principle is that the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait comes down substantially to effective deterrence. And effective deterrence comes down substantially to Taiwan building a set of defensive capabilities that are sustainable and well-resourced. And that requires the investment through a defense budget, and it requires a magnitude of investment along the lines of what I've seen put forward. It also requires being very thoughtful about what those capabilities are and learning lessons from the way that warfare is evolving today. So the types of new technologies that could be integrated into a defensive strategy are different today from 5 years ago, and that should be taken into account. But fundamentally, from the U.S. perspective, we have our job to do with respect to posture and capabilities in the region to make sure that we are sustaining deterrence. But Taiwan has its job to do, and that is to make the investments at scale and with speed to try to generate defensive capabilities that keep that deterrent posture quite robust in the years ahead.
Yeah, maybe a follow-up question on that. One contested point that kept raised within Taiwan is a delayed delivery on the items that were purchased in the past. And I know there has been a lot of solutions trying to solve this. And from your experience, especially having been in the role that look at the regional security, what can we do, or two sides can do to help make this better and as well as improve on this issue?
It's a very polite way of putting the question. What can the two sides do? Because really, this is our responsibility, not Taiwan's or anyone else's. One of the surprising things to me becoming National Security Advisor was looking at the health of the U.S. defense industrial base. And this came through in living color as the Russian invasion of Ukraine unfolded. We do not have the level of magazine depth that we need for major capabilities, either for ourselves or to be able to provide to partners on time and in full. And then you look at those timelines for a number of the capabilities that have already been sold to and promised to Taiwan and how far out they are, and trying to pull those forward was extremely difficult because we simply don't have the physical industrial ecosystem in the United States to scale and accelerate production. So over the course of my time as National Security Advisor, we invested a significant amount of money to try to create a more rapid pace of industrial production. And by the time I left, we had put a lot in place to do that. So I actually think we are making strides towards solving this issue, and that we should be able to, over the next few years, pull the timelines forward for delivery of major capabilities to Taiwan. This is absolutely essential. And not just to deliver our commitments to Taiwan, it's essential for the United States across the board. And this is actually an area of bipartisan support. The Trump administration has really picked up a lot of the efforts we laid down in the latter part of the Biden administration. So this is on us. We have to do it. We should do it. I believe we can do it.
I want to ask you about the role of allies in deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. And then during the Biden administration, I think there was just a considerable progress made in strengthening the support and the amount of attention that allies are paying to this. And partly, I think, because of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the sense that there was a connection between these different theaters, but also because of the understanding of the catastrophic impact that would have on the global economy if China were to use force against Taiwan, even though Taiwan is geographically so distant from much of like Europe, for example. So I sit here today where we watch our alliances fraying in many ways, and so I worry that maybe this might affect some of the support and involvement that allies have in Taiwan-related issues. So I'm wondering if you share that, and maybe you can explain why these allies, particularly in Europe. I mean, Japan, we understand, views Taiwan as existential to its security, so as we've heard from Prime Minister Takaichi. But of course, countries in Europe view this differently. So why is their role important, since they probably wouldn't be involved in military conflict if, God forbid, that were to break out?
So when Beijing is sitting there thinking about whether to take some dramatic action, up to and including a full-scale military invasion of Taiwan, we want them to think about what the costs and consequences of that would be. One part of that is what we just discussed, which is the military deterrence side. Another part of it is what would the impact be economically for China and also on their relationship with the rest of the world, relationships they deeply value. So a critical part of shaping China's calculus and maintaining a sufficient broad-based integrated deterrence in order to maintain peace and stability is to build as wide a chorus of voices saying to Beijing that if you proceed in this way, we will join in imposing costs and consequences for that. And Europe is central to that equation. And getting Europe focused on the fact, as you were pointing out, that if this actually happened, if the unthinkable or the thinkable of a major war over Taiwan unfolded, that the consequences for everyone around the world would be catastrophic, including for Europe, and that keeping that, preventing that from happening is essential. So we really invested a lot of time with European partners, but also with other countries as well, basically saying we need a collective way of describing how we would push back in the event that something like this happened. Now, what's interesting about this administration is they took our premise, which is that connecting Europe and the Pacific was an essential part of long-term effective competition and deterrence, and flipped it on its head, said, no. Europe should deal with Europe. We'll deal with Asia, and Europe should kind of stay out of here. So it's even more than just the fraying of the alliances. The entire kind of thesis around Europe's role in all of this has been essentially reversed in the Trump administration. I think that is a huge challenge, because if China basically believes this is an issue for which major other parts of the world are not invested or are not paying close attention, I think it will shift their calculus in problematic ways.
Jake, China's control of a critical mineral has emerged to be a strategic choke point. And during your term, you have championed the concept of a small yard, high fence. And looking back, have you thought about what strategic choke points that would likely to be a strong hold on the U.S. Competitiveness and capabilities? And if you were to redo it, how have you wanted to change the policy for that regard?
So the short answer is yes, we did look at strategic choke points. And yes, more specifically, we did look at rare earths. And we took a number of steps to try to alleviate or reduce the overall choke point or leverage that China had on the United States in that regard, including investments in these companies that the Trump administration has doubled down on, like MP Materials. But to your question, what should we have done differently? We should have moved faster. We should have moved faster and more ambitiously with greater alacrity. It's very difficult for a market economy like the United States to take policy tools to fix a market failure like the total domination of a critical supply chain like this. So, we use the Defense Production Act, we use various procurement tools, we, created the space to try to create alternative production for things like magnets. And some of what you see today is the result of those policy choices in the Biden administration. But frankly, we needed an Operation Warp Speed, which was our vaccine production in COVID, our policy. We needed an Operation Warp Speed, and we didn't quite do that. And I'm a little worried, actually, that the Trump administration is also taking good steps in this regard, but still isn't doing it at quite the level of alacrity that is required. Now, I will make one other point that I think is really important, which is when we were pursuing small yard, high fence on our side, and namely imposing export controls on semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, of course we thought about retaliation risk. We impose these controls, what will China do in response? And we looked at the various possibilities. And part of the idea of small yard, high fence was to communicate restraint on our part. Yes, we're doing things, but we're not going all the way. And that communication was meant to signal to Beijing, we could go further. So you should be restrained in your response to us. And in fact, they very much were. They didn't impose heavy rare earth export controls. They didn't drop the big hammer. They did more modest incremental controls on things like gallium and germanium, which we were able to manage for. So a lesson for me is that how to manage retaliation risk involves the right balance of pressure, of competitive moves and of restraint. And when President Trump came in and just laid down 145% tariffs, fired the bazooka, China all of a sudden was like, we're going to respond with the bazooka. That to me is a failure of statecraft. And that there is a way to manage through, even in the face of some vulnerabilities, if you do it right. And I think we saw a different approach in our export controls generate a response we could manage from China versus the approach that Trump took, which generated a response we couldn't manage.
U.S. export controls, just to dig into this a little bit deeper, have really evolved. We're not only just targeting chips, we're targeting this broader ecosystem now that enables advanced semiconductor development and production. So what should be our objective today? Should we be slowing China down? Should we be trying to preserve U.S. and our allied lead, or extending that lead? What should we reasonably be doing? And do you support this argument that the United States really should be focusing on ensuring that the rest of the world relies on our tech stack, and so therefore export controls really come at a cost?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me start with that argument because I don't fully understand it. The word tech stack is kind of obscuring what we're talking about. I mean, basically, if the United States sold on an unrestricted basis NVIDIA chips or Google chips or whatever to China, and they were able to use those chips to train very, very advanced models and also to serve those very, very advanced models, then they could spread those models around the entire world, and the world could be built on Chinese models on top of U.S. chips. Mm-hmm. Okay, fine. The U.S. chips are in the stack, but what's actually powering the stack? It's a model coming out of Beijing, shaped and trained by China, not by the United States. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a kind of category error in this argument of we'll get them relying on our stack. What do I think the purpose of these export controls is? And keep in mind that we imposed the first export controls just before the release of ChatGPT. Mm. So at the time when people were interacting with them, they were thinking of chip controls in a completely different context from the context of generative AI. But we saw ChatGPT coming. Mm. And our concept from the beginning was, what is the most important thing to power the future of artificial intelligence? It is compute. Mm. It is access to chips and the equipment that makes them. And this was a major advantage for the United States in the West. And we wanted to sustain that advantage. China has many other advantages, including power, but this is ours. So the idea was we are going to preserve this capability for our technology companies, and we're going to restrict this capability from going to Chinese technology companies to create a compute lead for the United States, which gives us an advantage in producing the most advanced models with all of the national security implications that come along with that. Now, part of this all depends on how does artificial intelligence, how do these models actually evolve over the coming years? And what is the timeline for that? And in the meantime, does China solve its compute constraints and produce chips at scale? They have not been able to do so far. Mm-hmm. It's proving to be a very challenging undertaking. But time horizons matter here, and we are in the middle of this story. So it is certainly the case that the controls have created a huge lead for the United States on computing capability. Whether that translates into a durable lead on AI or not, we will have to see.
Jake, digging deeper into the question of AI and national security, you think a lot about this issue. And I wonder, what are your thoughts on what China is doing in terms of power, their military and intelligence with their AI capabilities, and to what extent does U.S. have the knowledge of what they are capable of? And are we worried about China achieving AI parity or the diffusion of their open source models? And why U.S. more focused on, large closed models rather than not worry about, China diffusing their open source models sort of propagating across the world?
So I think there are kind of two issues here. One to do with their military capabilities, the other to do with this diffusion of their commercial models globally to kind of power AI use for commercial and educational and scientific purposes in the rest of the world. On the military side, we, at the end of the Biden administration, issued what I call a national security memorandum directed to the Defense Department, the intelligence community, basically saying, guys, we're ahead at the frontier of AI, but we are lagging in terms of the adoption and integration of AI into our military and intelligence capabilities. We got to move. We got to do more. And I think there was some resistance within our national security enterprise to the idea that generative AI was going to be revolutionary to the future of warfare. I think at this point that resistance has melted away. I'd also point out that the Biden administration's executive order, broader executive order on AI, Trump theatrically rescinded on day one or day two. The national security memorandum, as far as I understand it, has not been rescinded, has been continued because there is conviction across administrations that we need to do more and do better. And we recognize that China is working very hard to integrate advanced AI capabilities on both the military and intelligence side. And that goes for everything from sensing and surveillance and targeting to how you actually conduct warfighting itself with drone swarms, with lethal autonomous weapons of various types, with how you conduct command and control. So you go up and down the chain from logistics all the way to the tip of the spear, the proverbial spear, and China is integrating artificial intelligence into its method of warfighting. The United States, I think, has to continue to understand how that threat is evolving and be able to respond to it. And frankly, as Taiwan thinks about its own defense capabilities, it has to do the same. And that's what I was referring to earlier with where you put your resources into what types of capabilities. With respect to diffusion, I think China is making a kind of tactical bet that it can't quite get ahead at the frontier right now. So the best American closed model is going to be ahead of the best Chinese model. But if they open weight it, they open source it, and put it out there, then they can get deployment and diffusion to a greater extent than the Western models. I think this is going to increasingly cause American companies to think about open sourcing various types of models, and OpenAI did that last year. And I think it's eventually going to make China think, wait a sec, there may be a threshold of capability that's too powerful that we don't want to open weight or open source it. So you may see more convergence on this in the years ahead. I'm not sure. But this question of whether the open weight strategy of China might end up working is a real one. And I think it's one that is preoccupying the White House and preoccupying the U.S. technology companies as they think about how to proceed. I'll make one more point. As I was coming here today, I saw OpenAI testified before the Congress or submitted information to the Congress that they believe DeepSeek is using a method called distillation to basically fast follow U.S. models at a fraction of the cost in compute. Essentially, America trains the model. That becomes the teacher. DeepSeek's the student. It
learns it
through a set of very kind of sophisticated queries and then replicates it. If that's the case, that changes the game in terms of what this race actually looks like going forward. It also raises questions as we head into this season of symmetry between Xi and Trump that, what the United States says or does about this, because OpenAI is casting this basically as a form of theft. And this is a bit of a blank space. I mean, we haven't really had to deal with this in trade and economics before. So very curious to watch that. I think that's going to be a big topic in 2026.
Jake, it was during your tenure that the intelligence community revealed that Xi Jinping had instructed his military to have the capability to take Taiwan by force in 2027, although with the caveat that there was no evidence that he had the intent to do so. And so with that as background and based on the meetings that you were in and all the information that you had access to, I'm curious how you assess the risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait and whether you think unification is really a legacy issue for Xi Jinping. Now, of course, he's probably going to take on I think, fourth term. Most people believe. Some people think that he will remain in all of his positions and titles, or maybe he will give up some of them, but probably will be one of the major person at the top of the system, making decisions or influencing, shaping them for years to come. so it matters whether this is his absolute top priority and is a legacy, something that he absolutely wants to achieve during his term in power in his lifetime.
So the short answer is I don't know.
I won't let you get away with that.
No, I don't say that to be glib. Yeah. I think we have to have some humility here. So first on the question of near-term risk, I believe that right now China under Xi Jinping is pursuing a multi-point pressure strategy against Taiwan to try to change the status quo through means other than the big one. And I think they think that strategy is bearing fruit, and they will continue to do that. I think they also look at William Lai, and they worry he may do something with respect to a move that they perceive as a move towards independence that forces their hand in some ways. So they're worried in a responsive way about potentially having to take some kind of action. But overall, I don't think he's sitting there thinking, I'm going to go invade Taiwan this year or next year. I think that risk is there, but it is not that high at the moment. Now, does that risk rise towards 100% if he's just determined to do it before he leaves in 2032 or whenever that may be? My base case is that he's not absolutely determined one way or another he's going to have unification before he goes, but he is determined that the arrow is pointing in the right direction and that there is a clear set of indicators that we are moving towards and not away from unification. And that's a bit more of a discretionary kind of judgment a bit. But just as an indicator, I think his mindset will be different depending on the outcome of the 2028 election in Taiwan, just about which direction things are going. So that's my base case. But is it possible that he wants to be ready in 27 because he wants to make sure this happens as part of his legacy? Absolutely, that's possible. And we have to be prepared for that. So all the rest of it is a bit of what we could either call sophisticated analysis or educated guesswork, one or the other. So, yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
I share your view. I think that Xi Jinping wants to have the trajectory towards reunification, demonstrate that he's making progress toward reunification, but I don't think that achieving it, and of course nobody's really defined what reunification means anyway, the integration of some point. If the KMT were to come back to power, then I think things might calm down for a time, but that won't resolve anything over the long run. So I think Xi Jinping wants to make sure that that Taiwan is not really getting closer towards actually being able to achieve some kind of de jure independence. Yeah. But I do not think that this is really a legacy issue for Xi Jinping. And I think much of his rhetoric, actually, about Taiwan is just a continuation of what his predecessors have said. It's just that many more people are paying attention now to what the top leader says. So I'm not sure that his rhetoric is really that much tougher. And I don't think he has said anything to indicate that he has set a deadline.
Yeah.
So maybe one final question. President Trump, of course, will be meeting with Xi Jinping, we think in April.
Right?
We think.
I mean,
we're not sure. We don't have an exact date, but maybe it'll happen. And Taiwan is always anxious when leaders from the United States and China get in a room and have a summit. And it's understandable because Taiwan is often on the agenda. And we know that when President Biden met with Xi Jinping in San Francisco, that this issue came up. And I was part of Track 2 and Track 1.5 conversations where Chinese scholars told their American counterparts that the United States should revise its declaratory policy and say the United States opposes Taiwan independence or even better, supports reunification. That did not happen under your watch and in the Biden administration, but there is concern that could happen again. So if President Trump were to revise the declaratory language in some way, how consequential would that be? Is that something we really should be very concerned about?
It would be consequential. I mean, the formulations have really taken on an important life of their own in serving as part of the dynamic for deterrence and stabilization and diplomacy around the issue of cross-strait relations. So changing it creates a destabilizing impact.
Well, they've already changed quite a bit.
Well, right. And so I think it'd be consequential if he were to take that step. I do think it's different if he takes that step in a way that has a big rollout of U.S. policy has changed, or he takes a step like that through a statement at a podium or, through a true social post where then his people are saying, well, whatever, nothing's really changed all that much. So there's a lot of different flavors for how this could actually play out. Mm-hmm. And actually, I think Beijing is pretty sophisticated about this and is probably thinking, hey, how do we convince President Trump not to do some formal communique on this, but just to go out and say something. Right.
And tweet about it or something.
And if he just goes out and says it, then they will kind of
amplify it,
take it to the bank, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But a lot of other actors will work really hard to contextualize
and say our policy hasn't changed.
Right? So I think it'll be very interesting to watch what happens on this score. The one thing that I'm particularly concerned about is, we were talking earlier, does it make sense to change declaratory policy? And I said, probably not sure. One thing I feel absolutely sure about is you can't change declaratory policy in one dimension. Say, we're just going to change this formula to the disadvantage of one side and the advantage of the other side with nothing else. Because if you're going to do that, I think that would undermine the U.S. effort to try to sustain a robust deterrent posture and send the right signals. So I am nervous about just one tweak that wouldn't be part, if there were to be a change, which I'm not saying I support, but any change, I think almost certainly would have to be done in a way that takes into account both sides, not just one side, which I'm worried that what Beijing has been pushing for, what they pushed for in the Biden administration, is a change in just one direction.
Great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. We've been talking with Jake Sullivan, who, of course, is the former national security advisor to Joe Biden. And best of luck in your new role.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jake, for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.